Hi. Okay, so welcome or welcome back if you were at the office hour session before. Is anybody just new that they weren't able to come to the office hour session and are just now arriving to prove themselves with some TA training? Okay, cool. So we have something called micro teaching that the TLL is hosting next week. It's an opportunity to practice some teaching, get feedback on your teaching, observe other people teaching so that you can steal their best ideas for yourself. The registration for that is yelkey.com/father, and that registration form will close at 5 p.m. tonight so that I can sort people into groups. So if you're interested in doing it, make sure you do it before 5. Okay. I won't say that again. This is the third time for the people who are here before. So I'm happy to bring in our next, introduce our next speaker. So one of the things that I've been doing as the assistant director for graduate student teaching is going around and talking to graduate students in different departments to get a sense of what ways do you feel unsupported, what ways could the TLL come in and help you. And the number one thing that I've heard by a long shot is, I just don't know how to have conversations with my faculty members. What do I do if I feel like I'm working way more hours than I was meant to, I'm getting pressure from other faculty about how to manage my time in this way, and I just don't know how to have this conversation because the power imbalance is so huge between a TA and a faculty member. So, we're so excited to welcome Akshay, who is IREF's co-chair, and he'll be able to tell you a little bit about that program, give you some tips for communicating with your faculty. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Okay, can everyone hear me? Especially in the back? Good, okay. It's probably the biggest room I've spoken in ever, so no, I wasn't sure. Okay, so hi everyone, and welcome to this session on communicating with your faculty. My name is Akshay Agarwal, and I'm a 6th-year grad student in ACS. What that means is that I get a lot of, so when are you graduating? And I'm like, oh, I don't know, maybe in a year. So just to preempt that question. I'm also, as Ben mentioned, the co-chair of IREPS, and I'll talk a little bit about reps towards the end of this workshop. So this is a session on communicating with your faculty, how to have those important conversations with the faculty that you're a TA for, about your workload, about the expectations that you have going into the semester. So I'm hoping that by the end of this workshop, you will know how to have a conversation with your faculty about setting expectations going into the semester. And then when you're actually doing your job as a TA, if you find yourself overburdened, overworked, then how to frame the conversation that you might want to have as collaborative problem solving, as opposed to you versus your faculty. And I'll expand on those themes in just a second. But I thought I would just start off by asking everyone just to introduce themselves quickly. So just your name and what department you're in. So maybe we can start off from here. So just your name and what department you're in.
Okay, Zayla Schaefer, chemical engineering.
And then we can go around here.
Claire Haller, material science and engineering. Chemical engineering.
Stages, chemical engineering.
Amber, civil environmental engineering. Jocelyn, philosophy.
Oh, I guess we missed. I don't know.
From chemistry.
Yeah.
Cool.
Civil and environmental engineering.
Lots of chemical engineers here.
Chemical engineering.
And the person who just came in.
Yeah. What am I?
Just your name and your department, sorry.
I'm Aditya. I'm in EATS.
Okay. Okay. I can definitely tell which department made it compulsory for their TAs to attend this. Okay, so it looks like we have a good spread of departments, which is nice. So let's get into it. I'll first talk about the first objective here, which is how to have a conversation with your faculty before the semester to set expectations. And so if I could summarize the big takeaway from this, from the next 15 to 20 minutes of this workshop, it would be get as much information as possible. So you want to know exactly what you will be doing as a TA, how many hours you'll be spending, what ways the faculty expect you to teach or conduct recitations or whatever else that they're looking to have you do. So on the second, everyone have the handout? Ben mentioned a handout that is kept here at the front. So if anyone doesn't have it, if you just came in, you can grab it. So on the first and second, and I guess third pages of that handout, you'll find a lot of information about the kinds of information that you should collect before you start off. Yeah, feel free to come up and collect it.
It's the same handout that was distributed in the TA panels yesterday. So if you got one then, this is it. I haven't changed it.
Okay, so there's two broad things that you can do. And first, you can try to collect a lot of information on your own. So review, if you can find them, review old syllabi, lecture notes, problem sets, recitations, any old material that you can get your hands on. So that just gives you an idea of the pacing of the class, the content of the class, the particular material that the professor expects you to teach, and the way they expect you to teach it. And how can you get this material? You can get it from previous TAs. So if you know anyone who's TA'd the class that you're going to TA before, they're always a very good resource. When I did a TA for the first time, the previous TA for that class very generously gave me all of her recitation notes and all of her PSET solutions, so I was pretty much set. You can also, if you have taken that class before, which is probably the case for a lot of you, you have your own notes to fall back on. You can also talk to friends of yours who might have taken that class if you haven't yourself. And then the most direct way, I guess, is to just email the professor, right? They can give you access to, for example, the previous year's Stellar website. So then you can access all of the materials from that. Or they might just have these materials with them. So getting in touch with the professor is also a good idea. So I'll give you 1 minute to just scan through the first and second pages, which summarizes a lot of these same ideas. And then we'll pick it up from there. So just take a minute to scan through the first and second page of that handout. Okay, so it has ideas. The handout has ideas on getting access to old syllabuses, the Stellar website, etc. So the second thing and the most important thing that you should be looking to do is to set up a meeting with your professor to directly ask them about your workload. So just by a show of hands, how many of you have met your professors already to talk about the class that you'll be TAing in? Okay, and what were some of the things that you discussed at this meeting, if it wasn't confidential and you feel comfortable disclosing it? So any of the people who raised their hands, what were some of the discussions that went on? Yep. When you would meet to discuss problem sets, yeah? Other questions, discussions? Yep, at the back. The organization, so when do quizzes happen, when do problem sets happen? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Maybe one more person who had that kind of meeting, yep?
What are all the things that need
in the semester and
So what materials need to be made for the class, who's responsible, which is a really important question if you're in a class with multiple TAs, and then how long are those activities going to take. So these are all really important questions, and the second and third pages of your handout list out a lot of these questions. They're grouped by theme. So some questions along organization, some questions along responsibilities, and so you'll notice that a lot of these questions are very direct. It's very directly asking the professor, what am I expected to do? How many hours am I expected to spend? And I would encourage you to be very direct in these conversations. And also try to be quantitative. So ask your professors, how much time do you expect me to be spending on this? If they've taught the class before, they will have some experience with how much time it takes to design problem sets, to design recitations, and so they can give you these estimates. And so I want to give you 3 minutes to just scan through those questions. And you can pick out questions that appeal to you, the questions that you feel like, oh, wow, I should know this, questions that jump out to you. So just take 3 minutes to scan through that list of questions on the second and third page. And you can mark out questions that you think would be useful or relevant for you to know. Maybe 30 more seconds. Okay, so were there any questions that kind of jumped out to you or that you thought, oh, wow, I should really know this. I should ask my professor this. Any questions like that? Or any questions that you thought of while you were going through this? Yeah?
Like which of the responsibilities you're like grading or less resistant, recitation, office out, like what of those things we need to be in charge of?
Yeah, and I think that's a really important one because if you're in a class with multiple TAs, it could lead to conflicts. One person's expecting you to do the office hours, but someone else is expecting, so hashing that out right at the start is a really good idea. Yep. That's running for the first time, yeah. So the question is, what do you do if you're TAing a class which is running for the first time? I think in that case, the professor, again, becomes an even more important resource for you. If it's running for the first time, it's a good chance that they are the professor who's taking it is the person who designed that class. And so they should have an idea of the kinds of problems they want to use, the kinds of recitations they want to work with you. So you want to ask them all of these questions. Yeah.
What's the best way to communicate with the instructor? Because if you don't figure that out, then you'll never get
And so the second part of this workshop, which we'll come to in 10 to 15 minutes, is all about communicating with your instructor. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Other questions or thoughts? Yep.
This is a question, it might be more related to the second part, but should you wait for like the first email kind of, right? Should you wait for your professor to email you about like the first meeting for TAs? Or should you reach out like when's the time to, if the professor hasn't said anything yet?
I think it's completely okay to be proactive and reach out to them. As you know that you are going to be TAing for this person, and so I think it's completely okay for you to make that to write that first email and reach out to them. Yeah, and I think if you haven't had a meeting, then now is a very good time to do it because probably the professor is now in that stage of planning everything out, getting the details done. So yeah. Yep.
it's not one of these questions, but like what would be reasonable for you? Hours and number of people.
So before this workshop, I was checking the various departments' websites if they had guidelines for TAs, and I found a few which do. And usually the number of credits, units, hours that you're supposed to work as a TA every week is between 24 to 27. So that's a good number to keep in mind. If you find yourself working 50-hour weeks, that is not okay. So yeah, as you try to estimate how much time you're spending as a TA, it's a good number to keep in mind. And we'll talk about what do you do if you find yourself spending a lot more time than that in the second part. Other thoughts? Okay, so there was a question about how do you communicate, right? So before we get into discussions and maybe tips on how to communicate, we will try to practice it because I think it's always a good idea to practice these kinds of conversations before you go into them. And it can sometimes be hard to find the right language that you are comfortable using. So what I'm going to ask you to do is pair up. So find a person sitting next to you, sitting near you, and we will try to role play this conversation. So one of you is going to be the professor, and one of you is going to be the student, and then we'll switch after 5 minutes, and you both get to have a go. So yeah, can people just try to pair up? So is there anyone who's not found a partner yet? Anyone who's not found a partner yet? Okay, so the way this is going to work is if you see the third part of your worksheet, the third sheet of your handout, you'll see there's a table that we've made there which has common TA responsibilities, whose responsibility is it, and how many hours do you expect to spend. So again, you want to be as quantitative as possible. So as you do these conversations, just try to be very quantitative. Okay, and then we're going to do this for 5 minutes, and then after 5 minutes, we'll switch, and I'll warn you when 5 minutes are almost over. Okay, so you can start. Okay, everyone. So that's the first 5 minutes. So now I want everyone to switch, and the people who were answering questions now get to ask them, and just focus on questions that you might have found which were relevant to you, questions that you might find difficult to ask in real conversations, and just practice them out. So switch.
So terrible.
Different antibiotic.
I hope so.
Okay, let's bring it back, everyone. Okay, so that was great, and I could definitely see some of the people using their worksheets, so that was amazing. So do people have questions or thoughts that came up during that activity? What was difficult for you? What was easy? Yep. Sorry, could you repeat that?
How do you deal with the professor telling you to do everything? Like if you ask whose responsibility is this, and it's always you're running the whole.
So, well, I would hope that you don't encounter that, but if you do, so the question is, how do you deal with it if the professor just thrusts everything onto you? So I think what you want to do, and we'll talk about this a little bit in the second part of the workshop, is how do you advocate for yourself? You want to think about why the professor is doing that. It might be that they're just simply unaware. They don't know how long it takes to do any of this because they are experts in this field, so it takes them like an hour to do something which, for a student might take 6 hours. So they simply just don't know how long it takes. And so in that case, you want to make them aware of how long it's taking you to do some of these things. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. So I would say that in that case, as you start working and doing some of these things and it's taking you a long time, you want to make your professor aware of how long it's taking you. And you want to tell them that, hey, I'm spending 6 hours on this recitation. Can you help me prioritize some of these things? Can you help me figure out which is most important? And can we work together on some of these things? So that would be what I would do in that situation. Yep.
One good point that came up in our conversations was every time a professor says, oh yeah, I can give you the email,
Yeah.
that you should send them an email to remind them.
Yes, and that is the first point on my next slide, follow up over email. And this is general advice for grad school. Follow up on everything over email. You want it written down. Yes.
You're corresponding with students, like students have questions over email, whether they be administrative or something else.
Yeah.
And that can, in some courses, take a lot of time.
Mm-hmm.
The other aspect of that is what questions you have authority to respond to.
Yes.
Because you may or may not want TAs to be able to grant extensions.
Yes. So actually, I'm going to write that down because it's a really important point, and you can also write that down on your sheets, which is, so a possible question that you could frame is, who's So in PSETs, for example, right, the student might come to you and they might want to argue for a higher grade. Is it your responsibility to do that, or is it the professor's responsibility? So I had a friend last semester who faced this constantly, that students were coming to her and constantly asking for their grades to be increased. And ultimately, she talked to the professor about it, and then it was decided that all the students would have to go to the professor rather than the TA. So again, making a professor aware of these things that are happening can help with alleviating them. But that's a really good point, yeah. And you have a follow-up. Yep.
So also courses, there are managerial responsibilities. You might have to grade PSETs, but you also might have 20 undergrad graders and someone needs to be responsible.
Yes. So I'll talk about graders at the end very briefly, but that's another good point. So you might have managerial, so particularly in like larger undergraduate courses, you might be managing graders, or you might be like a senior TA who is managing some of the less experienced TAs. So hashing all of that out is also a good idea. So let me just write that down as well. Okay, other questions, comments? Yep.
Just speaking from having TA 5111 for a year, identify who the advocates are for grad students in your department. Like for us, that's the chemistry education office that goes back to faculty and says, look, this is unreasonable. Also, if you have unexpected things that you have to do come up, like write down how many hours it takes, and then email those responsible. So for me, it was correcting all the errors in the solution key that they sent. Like I had to, without having taken undergrad quantum, derive the Schrodinger equation in order to find all the errors in our solution key. And then also develop math content in order to make 5111 fair. So what I did was do that and then also write down, look, I'm supposed to be spending 16 hours TAing, and this is turning it into 30.
And so that is a really good point. And a sheet like this, the one that we have, can help you track how many hours you're expected to spend. And then if you find yourself spending much more than that, then that's a good basis for advocating on your behalf. Okay, so as was mentioned, you want to follow up over email. So the email could be, depending on how comfortable you feel talking to the professor, it could be as simple as, "Dear Professor X, thank you for meeting me. I have a better idea of what I'm going to do," or you might find better words than that. Or you can actually, if you have a copy of the sheet that you made, you can say, "Dear Professor X, thank you for the meeting today. Here is what we decided on for our course responsibilities." And the professor might themselves draw up a document like that. And so it is a good idea to follow up over email and have this document ready for your own reference and the professor's reference later on in the semester. Another thing I want to mention briefly is, if you're TAing for someone who's not your advisor, right, then for that semester, you'll almost have like two power centers in your life. You have your advisor and you have your TA. So you want to make sure that they are both on board with what you're doing that semester. So in addition to having this meeting with your faculty for whom you're TAing, you also need, I think, it would be a good idea to have a meeting with your advisor, with your PhD thesis or master's thesis advisor, and tell them that, hey, I'm going to be TAing this semester, so I'll be spending on average these many hours, and is that okay? And just see how, and just have them on board. So questions about that? That in itself can be a difficult conversation. And if you want to talk about that conversation, then we can discuss it offline. But any questions about stuff we've talked about so far? Thoughts? Okay, so let's move on to the second part of this workshop, which is going to be about what do you do during the semester. So you've set up these expectations, you've had this conversation with your professor, and then you find yourself working 50 hours a week, right? So what do you do then? So the answer to that, in principle at least, is simple, right? You just talk to the professor. You tell them that, hey, I'm having to spend a lot of time on this work. This is more than we agreed on. Can we do something about this? But there's something about that conversation which appears difficult, right? Something that at least when I imagine myself having this conversation with the person I'm TAing, there's something in my mind that's like, oh, do I really want to do that? So what is that something? When you think about this, what is that something that comes to your mind? Yep.
I feel like I should be able to get
Mm-hmm. So you feel like you should just like suck it up and do it, right?
Well, so there's two things. There's like suck it up and spend the time, but there's also like maybe the reason it's
I'm not good enough, and maybe if I was more intelligent, more smart, I'd be able to do this, right? Yep. What else? Yep.
What if absolutely told me no? He doesn't have a normal conversation with me, so as to tell me.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, he just
So the professor's kind of dismissive of anything you say, and they're just like, oh yeah, you should just do this. Yep.
What if the professor's also the advisor and like it looks
Yep. So if I could sum up those things in 2 points, it's power differential, right? The professor has power over you. They could be your advisor, in which case they play a very major part in your PhD and the success, hopefully success, of your PhD. I'm in my 6th year, everyone. And the second part is that internal conversation that's going on in your head all the time when you're having these external conversations. And in a lot of conflict management communities, it's called the identity conversation. And I'm going to present you some of the greatest hits from my identity conversations. Am I a good grad student if I ask my professor to reduce my workload, either as a TA or as a researcher? Should I just suck it up and do it? Am I chickening out if I'm telling them that, oh, so I can't do this as a TA, and you need to reduce my workload. What does this say about me? How does this reflect? In the mind of the professor if I ask them to reduce my workload? Right. So this is kind of what you were talking about. This identity conversation. You question yourself as a grad student, as a TA. So to begin to address this, I want to start by saying that it is completely okay to question your workload. If you've decided on something at the start of the semester and it seems like you're spending a lot of time, it is completely okay to ask those questions. To say that, hey, I'm spending 40 hours a week on this, it is not okay, and I want to do something about it. And I'm not even talking about questioning this to the professor. I'm talking about questioning it to yourself. It is completely okay to have that question. Because if you agree upon a certain amount of doing a certain number of things at the start of the semester, and you find yourself doing much more, there's something that you can do, or there's something that you should be doing or looking to do to correct that. So we talked about the gap between the faculty and you, right? There's this communication gap, there's this power gap, and I have a few ideas on how you can try to reduce this gap. And I think they can all be summed up as keep them informed. And I was trying to address your question before using this idea of instead of waiting for it to build up and instead of waiting for yourself to be spending all of that time, I think it's a good idea to, from the start of the semester, just keep telling your professor, hey, so we had the first recitation last week. It took me 3 hours to design it. It took me an hour to deliver it. That was a little bit more than what we had expected, so I just wanted to let you know. So I think it's a good idea to keep telling them of all the tasks that you're doing and how much time you're spending in each of those tasks. What that does is it kind of builds up a record of, firstly, how hard you've been working as a TA, and secondly, later on, if you want to say that cumulatively, I've been spending these many hours every week, and that's more than what we had expected, the professor already kind of knows that you've been doing all of this work. The second thing I want to say is you also want to keep them informed of discussions that are happening with other students in office hours. So because a lot of these problems can tend to snowball over the semester. And so you want to inform the professor of common student concerns, common questions that students are coming to you with, so that they can address those questions in class. So any questions about that before we move on? Okay. So how do you approach this conversation with your professor about reducing the workload? I would say that it's a good idea to think of it as a collaboration. So think of it as you and your professor versus this work that needs to be done instead of you versus your professor. So you can try to frame it as, can you help me prioritize my time? Or I've been spending more time than we had expected. Can you help me, or can we do this together? And I think what that does is it puts this conversation, instead of it being adversarial, it makes it collaborative, and you can both then look to solve that problem. So do people have questions about this approach? Does it not connect with you, or does it seem too easy to say, hard to do? So the general idea, again, here is to try to make it collaborative, make it not you versus the professor, but you and the professor versus this work that you want to do. Because usually professors want to deliver, or want you to deliver your best as a TA, and so they will be receptive to concerns about time that you're spending. And what may happen, as I was saying earlier, is they simply don't know how much time it takes to do a certain thing, because they are experts in this field and they've been doing it for a long time. And so it creates what's called the expert gap. They don't know how long it takes to do certain things. And so making them aware of that and trying to collaborate with them on solving those problems, I think can go a long way in addressing increased workloads. Okay, so kind of the last thing that I want to talk about is, as Mary was saying, resources around the institute which can help you as a TA to lessen your workload. So someone was talking about graders. So for those of you who might not be aware, graders are students who are hired by departments for particular courses to simply grade exams, PSATs, quizzes. And different departments have slightly different policies on graders. So they can be hired for the whole class, or they can be specifically hired for one exam. I've seen it done both ways. And so you want to find out what your department's policy is with graders, so you can talk to your department admins about that. And if you find yourself constantly correcting quizzes and PSATs, then this is one option that you can suggest to your professor. Can we get a grader for this exam? The other option is tutors. So for a lot of the institute level courses which undergrads have to take, there are options available where the department sets aside tutors that the students can approach for one-on-one coaching. So you can often find yourself overwhelmed with student requests for one-on-one coaching. And so in that case, talking to your professors about announcing in class the option of tutors, if they're available, is a good idea. And I want to mention the TSR Square, the Talented Scholars Research Room, in that respect, because they offer a lot of tutoring services for institute-level courses for undergrads. And so you can Google that and look them up and see if the classes that you're working on has this option. As Mari was saying, you want to find out in your department who you should talk to about these things. I know in ECS, we often go to the to our graduate officers. In different departments have different names for these people, but you should definitely find out who is the person to talk to advocate on your behalf in your department. The Teaching and Learning Lab has a lot of resources on online resources on designing and delivering recitations and different content to students, so you can look at that as well. And finally, I want to talk about REPS, which was my excuse for doing this. So REPS stands for Resources for Easing Friction and Stress. And the way the reps are organized is some of the departments have their own departmental reps, so they're called D-reps. And on the link here, and let me just see if I can follow it. But if you just Google MIT reps, you should find it. See if that works. Oh, okay, cool. So these are the departments which have their own reps programs. And you can see, oh, whoops. That is not reflected there. I need to. Sorry, just bring it up. Yes, okay. So these are the departments which have their own refs programs. So you can see if your department has one, and you can feel free to get in touch with your refs. The refs are a very good, so refs are trained conflict management and mediation coaches. So we undergo a 30 to 40 hour long training, which deals with having these difficult conversations and coaching people through conflicts and letting them generate options to move forward. So if you have a departmental reps and you want to practice some of these difficult conversations, then you should feel completely free to talk to them, to email them, reach out to them. And then there's what's called the IREPs. So if I can go back here. IREPs are institute level reps. So for the departments which don't have a reps, or if you're already in a department which has a reps, but you want to talk to someone kind of far away from home, you can approach us, the institute reps. And so we are also reps, but we are available to everyone, every grad student across campus. And we can also talk with you about these conversations, about any other issues you might be having in grad school. And any of the conversations you have with reps are confidential, so none of that is going to get out. So to summarize, we've talked about setting expectations. What do you do before the semester starts? And the big takeaway there is collect as much information as possible from as many people as possible. And during the semester, meeting those expectations, I think the big takeaway there is make it collaborative. So instead of making it antagonistic, you want to make it a collaboration between you and your professor. Okay, so do people have questions about any of the things we talked about? Remaining concerns, thoughts? Yep.
I work for TSR Squared. If you are using TSR Squared, please encourage the professors or TAs to send us their course syllabi. Like, for those of us who are graduate student tutors, we'd be able to help a lot more if we knew what was being covered in class, and it's kind of a constant issue because, well, unfortunately, in my case, biology and math faculty don't answer my freaking emails.
Oh.
In chemistry in my home department, I can always find the info from other grad students, but when I'm trying to tutor someone in a subject that's not in my department, I don't know who to go to.
Okay, so if you're using TSR squared, then I guess shoot them an email. Is that an email that
There's
it can
an
be
email
shot
for
to?
just the TSR squared office.
Okay,
So that would be the go-to.
okay. So you can shoot them an email about the syllabus that is being covered in the class. Other questions or resources that people know about which I did not mention here? Okay, so that was all. And oh, I should have given my email. I will write it here. So my email is akshayag@MIT. So feel free to reach out to me about any of the stuff we talked about today, or if you want to practice some of these conversations, if you feel like you did not get adequate practice today, I'd be happy to practice it out with you or talk about any of the other issues that might come up as a TA for you. So I wish you all the best in the semester. I know you all will do a great job as a TA, and thank you for listening to me.